Hey everybody, it's James Mulvaney. We're now live and welcome to the January 2020 edition of Backstage Pass. Glad to have you here. We're going out live across so many channels today. So many channels. We're actually going across live on Podcast.co, YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and also Radio.co. For the first ever time, I'm also broadcasting on LinkedIn. Now, I've been applying to get LinkedIn Live enabled for, I don't know, probably about 2 or 3 months. Finally got it through the other day. About 2 days before that, I actually posted on LinkedIn saying, does anyone have any idea of how to get this enabled? So finally got it enabled. So Backstage Pass is my monthly webinar, mainly focusing on audience growth. But actually what I'm going to be doing on LinkedIn Live is trying to kind of do sort of semi-regular broadcasts, just talking about entrepreneurial stuff, growing SaaS businesses, that kind of thing, and also talking about all sorts of awesome podcasting and radio tips as well. So we've got a fair bit to get through today. Really, the focus of today is to give you some quick and effective ways to get 5-star podcast reviews. This really is for new podcasters. If you already have a load of reviews, I would suggest turning this webinar off now because this isn't for you. And what this is for, what I really want to do is give you a sort of set of tools and strategies that you can implement right away. Because no one wants to listen to a lonely podcast. You know, if you've just started podcasting, and really the main reason for doing this is because we've had over 1,000 customers sign up to Podcast.co over the last kind of couple of months, since probably November time. A lot of these are new podcasters, and we've had a lot of customers coming to us and saying, I'm new, I don't have much traffic, and I'm not getting any listeners. So, you know, how can I get some reviews in? So I thought I'd do this webinar for you today and just sort of go into exactly how to get some reviews. What I'll be doing at the end is doing a bit of a Q&A. So if you're logged in on Facebook or Twitter, the channels are being monitored. So any questions at the end will be fed back to me. We'll have about a 10-minute Q&A at the end. So I think without further ado, what we need to do is dive into today's presentation. Let's just check that we've got this all working properly. Cool. Okay. And we'll get to it. I want to give you, as I say, some actionable strategies to get some 5-star podcast reviews. If you've just joined us, welcome along. Probably be about 20 minutes today's presentation. So nice and short. And as I say, we'll do a little bit of a Q&A at the end. So, firstly, to give you a background, as I've just mentioned, one of the things that does impact Apple Podcast ratings or iTunes rankings, Apple Podcast as it's now known, so they tell us off if we call it iTunes, so we're supposed to say Apple Podcast, but everyone also still calls it iTunes, so whatever you want to call it, it doesn't matter, but ultimately getting reviews on your podcast will have an impact on your rankings. So the more reviews you get, the more likely you are to appear up higher on the chart. Other things will impact this as well, such as the number of listens or downloads you're getting on your podcast, and also things like episode titles and that sort of stuff. They want to ultimately push the best quality content forward to their user base. And the review ratings are a really good indicator that, you know, the podcast is of good standard, of good quality. So, you know, I would say you don't want to sort of be faking this. We're kind of going to go into a little bit more detail of what not to do to begin with. Basically, you don't want to be doing this shit. First of all, don't go after these bots. You know, there's a lot of people out there peddling this stuff saying, yeah, this bot will, you know, rank you high up on the iTunes store. Probably best to ignore that sort of stuff. The only reason you want to ignore bots is because, you know, you ultimately will run the risk of getting penalized or even removed from the iTunes ranking. So firstly, big no. Don't be kind of being unauthentic about how you're approaching this review process. The other thing, I get these guys contacting me all of the time, and I just find it hilarious. You know, if you go into LinkedIn and you type in podcast promoter, you'll find dozens of people. Generally speaking, they're offshore, quite often in places like India, Bangladesh, etc. And, you know, they will promise to, you know, rank your podcast at number 1 on Apple Podcasts. You know, we get these guys messaging us all the time on Twitter, on Instagram, and, you know, I've never heard of anyone getting a good experience from these guys It's a con. I would strongly recommend avoiding any of these sort of slightly shady characters. They will probably take your money and run. I'm not saying I've ever tried this. Be interesting if any one of you have actually had some good experiences with these guys, but everything I've heard has been completely negative. So firstly, look out for the warning signs. You don't want to be engaging with these guys. Thirdly, don't spend ages writing your own reviews. Okay, maybe you can write one. In fact, if you're going to write one, what I'd suggest is writing something about your podcast. So rather than reviewing it, because obviously it's under your name. So here's my review I wrote. Talk about what's coming up. Talk about what's coming up in season 2, or, what your podcast contains. Kind of just use it as like an extended description. Okay, so that's not what to do. Now I want to give you 4 or 5 reasons, ways you can go and get more reviews. I think I should actually say 5. I might have forgotten to edit the presentation here. So, the first and most simple method to do is basically starting with family and friends. You can email anyone you like and give them a link to the Apple Podcast Store. Even if they don't use podcasts, the chances are they'll still have an iPhone. Anyone with an iPhone will generally have ability to write a review. So, family and friends, is absolutely fine. I know this sounds really obvious, but there's so many podcasts I see which are just sat there with no reviews whatsoever. And there's really no excuse for that. So, starting with family and friends, they're more than likely to help you out. It's only going to take a couple of seconds of their time. And as I say, we've had over 1,000 podcasts sign up to the Podcast.co platform in the last couple of months. When I look through these, I see so many which are just completely blank. They don't have any reviews. So a good starting point is family and friends. You could even go to a dinner party. If you sat around with a few different friends, just say, look, can I borrow your phone, mate? And they'll be like, whoa, you're not going to go through my pictures or anything, are you? Well, no, all I want to do is just go on the podcast app and write a review. Yeah, okay, sure. You don't even have to write the review for you. The one thing to remember here is you're kind of getting like a good range of different accounts and stuff writing your review. The last thing you want is everyone in the same IP address writing a review, because it's going to just seem like you're kind of writing yourself, or you're kind of creating bots or whatever. You want to sort of kind of go under the radar a bit and make this like undiscoverable. So the best way of doing this is have reviews from different devices, from different locations. Apple aren't going to then think you're up to no good. So next up, this worked a treat for me. If you work in an office, maybe you've got 20 or 30 colleagues who are maybe in your immediate sort of circle, get them to write a review. If you've got like Slack, or we use Google Chat, just post a link, just ask nicely, be cool about it, and just say, look, can you please write a review? Especially if you're doing this as a business podcast. You could even make it a requirement that all of your staff do this. I mean, this is kind of what I did. I just asked nicely, but I kind of said, look, I really need everyone to write a review of my podcast just to get the numbers up. It's a good way of quickly getting a bunch of reviews in. And of course, because different people are writing them, they'll put their own spin on it, and it's not going to sound like too repetitive and all that good stuff. So once you start building an audience, the next thing to do is incentivize your listeners. Now, there's a bunch of different ways you can do this. But kind of my bugbear with podcasters is there are lots of podcasters that are constantly nagging their listeners to write a review. Sometimes, you'll hear it 2, 3, 4 times throughout the podcast, and there's really no promise of actually offering anything in return. I think it's hugely important to actually say to your listeners, look, here's what I'm going to do for you guys. If you're willing to write a review of this podcast, I would like to share with you X. That can be anything. It might be you create a bit of unique video content, or you create sort of some bonus content, some episodes, behind the scenes material. Something that's going to be interesting enough for your listener to actually take action. This is really important, because the thing is, if you don't offer an incentive, why should they spend their time writing a review? And this, as I say, is kind of like what annoys me about a lot of podcasts. They don't really offer anything in return. It's like, yeah, you should write a review because I'm amazing. Well, no, give them something in return, and make sure it's something of value. And I know what you're thinking. How are we going to go then and find who's written a review? Well, the way to do this, I think, is get them to write a review. Once they've done that, ask them to either take a screenshot or even just copy and paste what they've written, and then send it to perhaps an email address. Now, the chances are no one's going to do this and kind of fake it, so you could even just set up an autoresponder, so you could have like free content at yourpodcast.com, and whenever someone sends that address an email, they get an auto response with a link to the bit of bonus content. The chances are anyone who emails that address is going to have genuinely written a review, so I think you can trust your listeners enough to do that. It's going to save you a lot of time. You don't even have to check if people are actually writing these reviews, but incentivize them. Make sure you're giving them a template to follow. Like, here's how you go and write a review. Again, you can potentially set up a vanity URL. So a lot of podcasters will have something like please review bob.com, and that link will then redirect listeners directly to the review page of Apple Podcasts for that specific podcast. So it's an easy way to read it out during your podcast, and it's simple enough for listeners to follow. And then say, look, once you've done that, please send a screenshot of your review to this email address, and I'll send you all this awesome extra content, or bonuses, goodies, whatever you want to call them. So that's a really nice strategy to sort of build a better relationship with your listeners, whilst also getting those all-important 5-star reviews in. Okay, so my next quick strategy is, and this is really simple, leverage the goodwill of your guests. Now, every single podcast generally has some kind of interaction from guests, but a lot of times people forget that you're kind of doing someone a big favor. If you're interviewing someone on your podcast, you're helping build their profile, and also, potentially you're exposing their business to a wider audience or whatever it might be. So make sure that when guests are actually, appear on your show, you incentivize them to sort of write a review after. And the way to do this really is just say, look, as I've got in this sort of template, you have to be cool about it. There's no, I've been interviewed on podcasts before where it's like you have to write a review in order to appear on this podcast as part of the strategy. I kind of feel like that's quite aggressive. You don't need to go and be that aggressive. What I would suggest is, once their episode has gone live, or on the week it's due to go live, you reach out to them, say it's great speaking to you. Generally, it's a good idea to do this anyway, and just let them know, and ask them to help promote your podcast, help promote their episode on their own social channels. To help it get more ranking, to help it get more listeners, please write a review for it. That's really the angle that you should be going at with guests, because ultimately, they want exposure as well. They want their episode to do well. They want it to appear in the rankings on Apple Podcasts, etc. So, if you explain to them every review you get will help them do this and achieve this goal, they'll be more than likely to help you out there. Okay, so finally, remember the call to action. I've kept this brief on purpose. I want to give you 5 quick strategies here. These 5 things, I guarantee if you do all of them, will get reviews coming in very, very quickly. So finally, remember the call to action. Basically, you need to ask. You need to ask your guests. You need to ask your listeners. As I mentioned earlier, ideally offer an incentive, but remember to include it as part of the podcast. Now, as I say earlier, you don't have to overdo it. You don't have to even do it on every single episode. Maybe just do it on the final episode of the season, because if people have been listening to, perhaps 6 different parts, and they've reached that final episode, and you say, look, this is episode 6, we're going to be back soon. If you've enjoyed this season, we would love it if you could write a review. And, and then also we want to send you a bonus 7th episode, for example. For anyone who does write a review, we'll send that to you. You just need to email iwroteareview@mypodcast.com, and we'll send that to you straight away once you've written the review. And, the call to action is very, very important. It's amazing how many podcasters, I think, either get it wrong or, they just totally overdo it, and it becomes like more of a nag than kind of a clear call to action. But ultimately, I think call to action, it's important, and you can really leverage your audience once you start growing it. Okie doke. So now we'll just go quickly over those. So firstly, before I cut back to the camera, we'll just go over these 5 reasons to write a review. Actually, we started what not to do. Do not use bots. Don't use podcast promoters. Offshore, more like toss off. All right. Don't write your own reviews. You can write one, but use it as a teaser of what's coming up in the season rather than sort of saying, oh yeah, I'm great, because it just looks a bit weird. Then 5 things to actually get you going reviews. Start with family and friends. Annoy your colleagues. If you've got people who work with you, especially if you're building a company podcast, make sure you get your team involved with this. Offer an incentive to your listeners. Don't just nag them coldly and ask them for a review. Make sure that they're getting something in it for them. Also, leverage the goodwill of your guests. Ultimately, your guests want the podcast to do well because it will help them with their mission, whatever that might be. And also, remember the call to action. So, without further ado, what I want to do is just switch back to the camera. So here we go. I'm just still getting my head around this live stream stuff. And I want to take some of your questions. So if you've got any questions, feel free to reach out via the social media platforms. We are live across Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, etc. And we'll try and go through a few for the next kind of 5 or 10 minutes just before we come to an end. So let's see what we've got. First of all, Jonas in the Netherlands. How do I get my podcast on iTunes? So if you're a Podcast.co customer, Jonas, the easiest and the quickest way of doing this is to use our submission process or our submission service. So it's really easy. All you have to do is just basically give us permission to submit your podcast to the major directories on your behalf. What we'll do is we'll push it out to iTunes or Apple Podcasts, as it's now known. We'll also push it out to Spotify, amongst various other platforms, Breaker, Opencast, etc., etc. Let's have a look at what else. Kurt from Aberdeen, good class, James. Have you seen results from including a CTA at the end of a podcast? Well, like I say, yeah. I mean, I think asking your listeners, your fan base, to engage and write a review is kind of really important, right? What I would say is, don't feel bad about doing it, but also be cool about it. I think there are too many podcasters that just get aggressive and sort of, push people too much to review their podcast. What does it say? I feel like a little bit needy about doing it. Well, don't feel needy. Just make sure that you kind of just do it in a cool way, and you kind of do it on a regular basis. Okie doke. What else have we got? So, Faye Cambridge. Can I read out 5-star ratings at the start of a podcast? That will entice more of my listeners to write them. Yeah, I think that's a good idea because, again, it's building that connection with your audience and really engaging with people. Like I'm taking these questions here at the end of this live stream. I think, if you can name listeners, they love it because they feel special. They're getting a shout out. And it kind of feels almost like, when you're a kid and you're growing up and you're listening to a radio station, you get a shout out on the local radio station. That's a really exciting thing. So, use that sort of mechanism to encourage people for sure. But again, I would say keep it to a minimum. You don't want your podcast to end up being overtaken with, shout outs to listeners, and it can just become a bit annoying. So maybe do 2-3 an episode. I don't think necessarily doing it at the start of the episode is always the right thing either. Maybe you want to start doing them at the end, because ultimately for the majority of your listeners, you want to keep to making sure you're doing good quality content first and foremost, and then the engagement stuff can perhaps come in the middle or later on. Okay, Frank from Tennessee. Can I remove bad ratings from the Apple Podcast store? Well, I'm not sure about that, Frank. I think, ultimately the whole idea of the review system is that people can write their honest opinions. So I believe you might be able to report a review if it's like abusive, if people are sort of swearing or saying stuff that's completely incorrect, or, it's considered slanderous. I think ultimately, you need to be pushing to encourage good reviews by producing good quality content. And, I think when you're doing a good job of your podcast, ultimately people should want to write a good review for you. Again, no one's perfect. The topic of this sort of stream was how to get 5-star reviews. There are some hacks which kind of encourage people to do that, as I've just mentioned, because ultimately that will give you that initial boost that you need. But then over time, of course, you know your reviews might not be perfect all the time. You get 2-star reviews, you might get 3 or 4-star reviews. It's the same with everyone. You know, not every bit of content is going to be perfect or speak to everyone in the right way, or the same way rather. You know, some people will resonate better with your podcast than others. That's just a fact of life. But you know, ultimately as well, reviews can be a really good tool to actually take on board feedback and see, you know, how to reiterate and improve, you know, season upon season. So, you know, if people are saying that episodes are too long and, you know, you're getting a few comments saying, well, this just drags on, well, make it shorter, you know, because perhaps that's a sort of sign of you know, if people are actually spending time writing that and trying to give you that useful feedback, well, you know, it's certainly good to listen to them. Do 4 or 3-star reviews have a similar effect to a 5-star review? From Bernadette. Well, like I just said, you know, I think it makes it look more real. Certainly, you know, when you're getting your friends to write reviews, you can maybe get a couple of people just to put 4 stars instead of 5, and maybe it looks a little less manufactured that way. But ultimately, you know, the more sort of 1 or 2-star reviews you get will just ultimately drive down the overall ranking of the podcast. As I mentioned at the beginning, you know, Apple's main goal is to you know, push quality content to their audience. So they want to make sure that the podcasts that get the most reviews and get good quality reviews, and there are plenty of 5-star, 4-star, 5-star reviews, will generally rank higher than podcasts that have got no reviews whatsoever, or have got loads of people just saying this is a bunch of rubbish, don't listen to it, because, you know, that's the point of the review system, right? Matty Koss, this is coming via LinkedIn. Hi, Matty. Thanks for watching on LinkedIn. As I say, this is the first LinkedIn broadcast I've done. How cool is this? Very, very exciting. How do you feel about reviewing other podcasts and asking them to do the same for you? Yeah, I don't see any problem with that. You know, like swap reviews with people. You know, ultimately, you know, let's be honest. It's kind of wishful thinking, oh, yeah, you put a podcast up and you shouldn't write any reviews. They shouldn't be manufactured. That's just not the case, right? That isn't. If you believe that, you're just completely dreaming. Like, every single successful podcast on the iTunes store will have done something like this to begin with. You know, I'm not saying that everything should be completely manufactured. And at the beginning of this presentation, I specifically said, don't use bots, don't use these podcast promoters. You know, get good quality reviews written by your friends across a variety of different platforms, IP addresses, just so it doesn't look like, you know, you're just spamming the system. It's a good way of faking it, but doing it kind of in an authentic way, if that makes sense. But, you know, ultimately, you need a leg up to begin with. And as I say, we've had over 1,000 podcasts join our platform since November. And, you know, I'd say probably 85 to 90% of them haven't got reviews at all, which is kind of like a concern, because ultimately you're going to hinder your chances of success unless you get a few, or at least a few reviews coming in soon, and then hopefully you can get some more organic ones. Right, so couple more questions here, just to wrap up. From Reese Jones, what content is trending right now? I don't know. You tell me. Like, I think ultimately you need to. This is a very broad question. There are loads of tools that you can use to do research. Specifically, if you're talking about podcasts, just go onto Apple, find the category that's relevant to you or your business, or you know, whatever message or whatever sort of podcast you're trying to create, and just look at the top 10 podcasts for the country. You know, again, the cool thing about the Apple podcast charts is they are not sort of global, they're kind of country specific as well. So, you know, what's number one in the UK is completely different to, you know, in say like marketing and business is totally different to what's number one in the US in marketing and business. And quite often you'll see crossover. But, you know, do some research and have a look at what else is out there. Also, how do you go about hiring your podcast studio in Manchester? If you go onto our website, actually probably best if you just drop our team an email, hello@podcast.co, and someone will get back to you with some more information. All right. So, I think I'll just take one last question because I think this is quite interesting. So it's not about reviews, but it's about episode titles will help with ratings, and can I give some examples? Well, I don't have any examples in front of me right now. This is from a guy called Gary. But what I would say, Gary, is bear in mind, people are searching constantly for stuff, right? So I might type into Google how to raise finance for my company. So I'm just giving you an example of my most recent episode. I interviewed a guy called Nick Horrocks, who is a corporate finance expert. So a lot of the content we created around the podcast episode basically references kind of key search terms like this. So when you're promoting a podcast, I would suggest not just thinking about the actual episode itself, but things like a blog post, social media posts, audiograms, videograms, that sort of stuff. The kind of content you push out on social media as well. And you want to think about, and also we turn each podcast into a YouTube video as well. And we always think about what people are actually searching for. So if the topic of the discussion is around raising finance, we will keyword it in such a way that attracts or tries to siphon off traffic of people who are looking for that kind of stuff, rather than say someone who's searching for the person specifically who I interviewed, because not everyone might know that guy's name. So it's trying to get traffic that's relevant to the podcast, and we think the podcast will ultimately help people who are searching for that, because that's what we're discussing. Okay, so just to finish off, for those of you who don't know me, my name is James Mulvaney, and I'm founder of two companies, Podcast.co, which I've mentioned, also a platform called Radio.co as well. I am an entrepreneur. I've been in sort of the broadcasting, online streaming space since about 2004 now, so a long time. I also have various other business interests. I've got a few properties, different investments. So I'm starting to produce more and more content around these topics. Feel free to hit me up. If you go onto my website at create.co, the best thing to do is subscribe to my mailing list on there, because I'll be sending out information of videos like this one I'm creating for you, also live broadcasts. These backstage passes, generally they're around audience building, and we're going to be doing one every single month. Last month in December, I did one about how to grow your Twitter audience. Today, obviously, about 5-star reviews. Next time, in kind of February, I will be talking about how to get really good guests for your podcast. And we're going to be talking a lot about guests because we are about to launch a new platform called Matchmaker, which I'm really excited about. And that's specifically to help you book really good quality guests for your podcast. So if you want to be notified about the next live broadcast, visit create.co, go and check it out. And if I don't knock everything over. And I look forward to speaking to you soon. Thanks very much for watching today. It's been a great pleasure. And we'll catch up very soon. Okay, take it easy. Bye for now.